Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the panel discussion Cybersec for Development, Bridging the Global Gaps in Cybersecurity. So please, let's start with a round of applause for our excellent speakers. And also to warm you up a little bit, please. So first, the rapid rise of a cross-border digital realm has been an amazing enabler for countries and citizens worldwide. Digital technologies provide already billions of people with access to basic services such as healthcare, education, administration, or banking. In so doing, they constitute a breakthrough in pursuing the UN Sustainable Development Goals. However, this new realm of human operation is not just this rosy. The digital is also about the challenges and actually outright threats. Building a secure and thriving digital ecosystem, or digital DNA, requires coordinated actions from governments and the private sector. Each country is different, so it must find its own path through the digitalization. However, inspiration and experiences from other countries and regions can greatly support in successfully navigating this process. We have gathered here the outstanding stakeholders from Poland, North Macedonia, United States, and Switzerland, and we will aim to highlight the chances, opportunities, and challenges presented by the emergence of cybersecurity industry and new technologies sector in developing countries. But first, let's set the scene before we look outside. So my first question is to two ministers. Maybe we can start with Minister Niedużak, and then the same question to Minister Manczewski. Digital transformation is happening now and is quickly reshaping our economies and societies. Would you say that the opportunities associated with the digital revolution are clearly identified and taken advantage of by your countries, by Poland and North Macedonia, both by the public and the business sectors?
Thank you very much for that question. I think the way it's formulated, my answer can only be no, but I will try to, develop it a little bit. So, of course, it's not entirely taken. I mean, we didn't take advantage of it fully. Let me start with the state area, with the administrative scope of activity of our state. There are some areas where I think digitalization happened and IT is part of the government's infrastructure. And a good example is what belongs in a way of this is what we do it at our ministry. A good example is what we call in Polish CIDG, which is like a central register of entrepreneurs. So every person who would like to conduct business activity as I don't mean set up a company, but as a physical person, which is the most popular form of conducting business activity, she or he can do it via internet. And actually 20% of our entrepreneurs do it online. Yeah, they don't contact gminy, communities where this competence is located. They do it online, and this is an example of success. But of course, there are many other areas where we still, in 19th century, if I could say so, where it's still paper, where it's still you have to be somewhere in person. Or maybe via power of attorney, but basically, so there's a lot of areas where we can grow, we can expand our activity as a government or as like state activity, but that it also includes communities and local authorities.
So, what more can state do to stimulate business and cybersecurity within Poland?
I think the most important job for us to do would be education, you know, because when we look at obstacles, a very important factor is lack of qualified people, and I don't only mean, you know, excellent IT experts, but I also mean people who'd work on the mid-level. They don't need to be you know, outstanding IT specialists. They can just be good at what they're doing. And I think we really, when you look at obstacles for Polish businesses, because you also asked me about the commercial sector. So when you look at obstacles in the commercial sector, one of the most important is lack of qualified workforce, of qualified people. So addressing your question, education, but probably would be the best thing that we could do. Of course, it's not a short-term solution, but in the mid-term and long-term, that will be the key aspect. And just, you know, three sentences about the commercial sector or the economy. I would say it's a very mixed sort of situation. It's very difficult to describe it with like one sort of like grade or assessment, because there are sectors like banking sector, for instance, that's very modern, probably more modern than in a lot of Western European countries. But then, of course, you've got SMEs, and a lot of those SMEs are probably not fully aware of all the possibilities that are waiting for them in that area.
Okay, thank you very much. Then, Minister Manchevski, what about opportunities being used by North Macedonia, by the state and business in North Macedonia?
Well, thank you for the question. I would say that we are kind of in the middle of it. Since we are practically, we just launched the electronic register of the population. And we've adopted last year and the beginning of this year all the legal environment regulating the EID of the citizens. Fully aligned with EIDAS, we've adopted GDPR. We are about to adopt the legislation concerning NIS. So we're about to define our critical infrastructure, and the cooperation with the private sector is especially crucial here, because most of the critical infrastructure is actually in the private sector, and we need to set jointly the rules, the legislation, and the cyber resilience towards these for our critical infrastructure. I come from the private sector, although I'm in charge of information society and unfortunately the administration. But I'm trying to think from within the administrative system, but with the mindset of the private sector. And it sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't. But it is key to be efficient into implementing all of these systems. So I agree what my colleagues said, that sometimes the private sector is more advanced than, of course, the institutions. But let's try to make it the other way around. What the public sector must do is envisage, predict the new technologies, upcoming technologies, into the legislation. We don't have to wait for them to come in order to provide a legislative environment for them to be implemented. So this is what we're trying to do. And for instance, in our national legislation, we have implemented part of the laws that will allow implementation of new technologies, blockchain, installment of qualified digital certificates on our mobile devices, something that we're engaging in the spirit exactly as we speak. And this is what we can do. Make it easier for the new technologies, upcoming technologies, to be implemented in the public sector, but also by the private sector as well.
Thank you very much for this constructive answer. And let's jump or sink into fully the private sector mindset. So, Mr. Andrzej Dopierała, is there still room for improvement in developing a proper cybersecurity industry in Poland? And what examples of successful cooperation, for example, between public and private sectors, do you have in mind that could serve as an inspiration for us in Poland, maybe elsewhere too?
Yes, thank you for the question. And again, the short answer is yes, there is room for improvement because, well, there is always room for improvement. And no matter how good we do, we can always do better, which is obvious truth. Now, coming back to the concrete answer, I do believe in a public-private partnership, and I look with some amount of envy to how our colleagues in Israel, for instance, are doing this. I know this example because as Eco Group, we are present in Israel, and we have some companies there active in defense and also in cyberspace, in cybersecurity area. And what I mean is there are certain government or state-owned companies which attract top talent from the universities and then help this talent being developed. At the same time, these government or state-owned companies, they work with other Israeli companies who are acting as subcontractors to them. And of course, they have all the clearances that are needed, and this creates like a snowball effect. So they have good cybersecurity industry, so they are making very advanced solutions. So there is more and more people being attracted into the field, and their top talent wants to have a career in cybersecurity, so they go to the universities. They have very high level of education. They're really training good professionals. Some of them are like artists. Some of them are just a solid craftsmen, and this way they are really building their national cybersecurity. I was told that even since Israel is a great ally with the United States, but still I understand that certain cybersecurity solutions they are developing on their own. They really want to depend on themselves in certain areas totally, not to be dependent even on their closest friend, which of course the United States is. And when I now come back to Poland, I believe that we are lacking that at this point of time. So we're not doing all these things that are being done in the example I just mentioned from Israel, or maybe not. We're doing some of it, but we could do more. For instance, our cybersecurity industry, I believe today, I wouldn't say it's very strong. Yes. So one thing is, if you look at the amount of Polish cybersecurity solutions, which are well known around the world, it's not that much. Even coming back to Poland, usually we rely on the global solutions, and the amount of our own IP which we are creating is very limited. I do believe that government could help working together with the private sector to change that. And I'm not saying that we should develop everything ourselves and we should forget about great companies from the US or Israel. We want to, they make great products and great technologies, and we want to work with them. However, still we should have more of our own products, which we could depend on 100% of as made in Poland. And so that's one area I believe we should be doing more. So helping to create Polish cybersecurity industry. And actually this recommendation goes to any country which would ask me for my opinion, and actually we're trying to do some cybersecurity business in Africa, in many countries there, and they are listening to it, and they resonate quite well. Second area, it's totally different, and this has to do with education. And education, when I say education in cybersecurity, I mean starting from kindergarten all the way through nursing homes. Because, as we all say, this is a truism that cyber and digital is entering almost every aspect of our lives, and entering at a very early age. So just as much as we teach our kids in kindergarten, don't talk to strangers, don't cross the street without looking, and so on, we should tell them, watch out what you put on your Facebook, yes, or whatever you do in the cyberspace. Probably parents don't tell them, but if the schools don't tell them, they kind of experiment and learn on their own. So I believe that's one thing. So permanent education, and of course the type of this education and the content, this should be adjusted to the audience as always. And the third thing would be fostering some bottom-up movements. So there are people who are really passionate about cybersecurity, and I admit, I would even say that they are a special breed of IT people. in a very good way, yes, that they are really passionate and they feel they have a mission. So it's very good to help them to connect. We'll give you, several years ago, Estonia was under attack from unidentified, let's say, hackers. And despite of all the countermeasures which were taken by the government, actually, their hackers and their professionals, they were organizing themselves without any call or any directive for that. It was just spontaneous, but they were kind of like, okay, they are attacking us. We will defend ourselves because we will be smarter than them. Yes? So I do believe again that the government can foster such initiatives, can help them, and help these people work together and come together.
Thank you very much. So, national cybersecurity brands, niches, education, lifelong education, and fostering bottom-up movements, also by the governmental support. Okay, Mr. Painter. There is a lot of room of improvement, as we hear, within the states, but what about the international cooperation? How can we develop that?
So, I mean, I think Poland and North Macedonia and some of the other countries in Europe are pretty far advanced in thinking about how we're building what they call public-private partnerships. They have a private sector that's active. There's a way of dealing with them. A lot of the world's not there, though. A lot of the world, particularly the developing world, in Africa and parts of Asia and parts of Latin America, are still really trying to figure out how to engage in this area. And so one key aspect of this is to build the capacity of these countries, to work with these countries, to bring them up to speed in terms of having some of the basic things that now most of Europe has, which is national strategies in cyberspace, to have institutions like national level certs that will help with the technical aspects, to actually have this idea of building a public-private partnership. I think almost every country in the world is now interested in this, but we need to be able to really up our game in working with those countries. One of the organizations I've been working with since leaving the tepid embrace of the government is something called the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise, and this is a multinational group. Lots of different countries are involved. Lots of different private sector parties are involved, civil societies involved. And really the goal of that group is to rationalize and help coordinate this capacity building across the board on everything from norms of behavior and diplomacy through to how to build a cert and standards. And I think the more we can do that, the more we can do that as a world community and bring all these countries up to speed, that helps all of us too, because international cooperation, you do international cooperation to benefit the other countries, but you also do it to benefit yourself. And you need, given the transnational nature of cyber attacks, cyber intrusions, cyber crime, you need to be able to work with partners around the globe, because if I'm a smart cyber attacker or smart cyber criminal, I used to be a prosecutor going after these folks, you never, even if you're in Poland attacking a target in Poland, you will route your communications and your attacks through several other countries in order to make it hard to catch you. And so that level of cooperation is urgent, and you need it on a technical level, you need it on a law enforcement level, but you also need it on a policy level. You need the policy people, whether they be diplomats like I was in the State Department, or people in the president's or prime minister's offices, to be able to reach around to other countries in the world when we have one of these major incidents and get cooperation and build a collective response to some of the shared threats we have. And I think that collective response means getting not just traditional allies, but really all the countries in the world who can do it, to work together to really face a lot of the threats we're doing. So international cooperation is really, I think, an urgent need, and capacity building is an urgent subset of that we need to support.
So, following up on this, could you also mention some concrete barriers that now prevent this kind of cooperation?
Yeah, look, I think countries are in very different levels of development. I think they have very different systems of government. So every country has their own. And I think what's happened is, first, the resources are constrained. Even a big country like the U.S., we put money into capacity building, but not nearly enough. And I think one of the problems that we've seen is it's been somewhat disorganized. Different countries do capacity building, and they might train the same 3 people in a country, and that doesn't help. So you need a strategic plan for doing that. So this is why this GFC group, I think, has been very important. And the other challenge is that these countries are dealing with lots of other problems. It's not just cyber. Cyber is important. I've done cyber my whole life. I care about cyber, but they have lots of other issues. They have in making sure they have investment, making sure they have electrical power, making sure they have clean water. But cyber can be a great enabler for all of that, an enabler for investment if they do it right. So, I've seen instances like in Africa, when Kenya got a cable drop and got massive connectivity for the first time, and they developed really innovative banking systems. But they had the opportunity to think about cybersecurity from the beginning in a way that the US, we kind of added cybersecurity later on, like most of Europe did. We stapled it on existing things. So that I think the opportunity was there, but you need the political will, you need to make this more than a boutique issue, and you need the resources to do it.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Bam, how do you think the experience of slightly more advanced countries could serve as a compass for the other developing economies to successfully achieve their digital transformations, and how?
Thank you for the question. So I really struggle with the concept of more advanced countries. As you said, we all are at a different level of maturity, but the truth is that we all have started the journey at a different sort of point in time. We had the luxury of bolting on security onto whatever happened, whatever the digitization trend brought over the last 20 years. And some of the African or developing countries have been sort of thrown in there with the technology being made available to them, yet without really considering much of what the impact and from a security standpoint will actually be. And but a lot has been already said, that make probably responding to the question a little bit more difficult. We talked about the private-public sector cooperation. I think, when I think of this from a UBS standpoint, so a company that is present in 50 countries, a global financial institution, it's absolutely incredibly difficult to discard the dependencies we have on the critical infrastructure across the different countries where we are actually present. Meaning, cyber risk is a global problem. Cyber threats are global, and the moment they become successful and have material impact, whether on us directly or the dependency that we have, we all suffer and we all lose. That's why I think it's important to understand we're all in this together. It's absolutely fundamental to invest an effort that we can afford to invest in capacity building wherever it's possible. And it's absolutely important to establish trust-based relationships that ultimately the dialogue is built and based upon. It's easy to manage information security from a compliance perspective. I mean, it's easy, obviously, it's a massively complex topic, but it's much easier than managing the actual active threat. And the moment that threat becomes material and has significant impact on, be it us directly as a financial institution or one of the dependencies that we have, it becomes something we absolutely need to manage properly. And I'll probably speak a little bit more about concrete examples of how UBS invests in sustainable goals globally, and by that I mean developing communities, supporting different places where expertise is in high demand. A little bit later during a different session on one of the side streams. But ultimately, I think the key message here is it's a problem that we all share and we all have to contribute towards.
Yes, so this is a problem we all share, and the cyber risks are global, but there are large gaps in tackling them between countries, but also within countries, for example, between industries and companies of different sizes. What are the major steps to bridge this divide? And this is the question to Minister Niedużak.
Thank you. Well, I think the short answer will be a cooperation. I mean, if you're a country like Poland, mid-sized country, EU member, then you need to look for partners to work with, and I think that's what we're doing as a government, as a country. I mean, we're trying to cooperate within NATO framework. We're trying to cooperate within the European framework, and there's simply no other alternative to that path. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Minister Manczewski, how significant for North Macedonia, or in general for the Western Balkan region, is the international cooperation and support in the process of establishing innovation and digital entrepreneurship ecosystem?
Well, as we are all saying, it is very important. As the cybercrime as well does not recognize borders, that the solution of these issues also should not be on national level. And there are many things that we can actually do together on multinational level or regional level that we are doing in Western Balkans. European Union is helping, NATO as well. Capacity building is something that we are very much recipient of support, and we were from especially US, UK, but there were the Korean agency for cybersecurity. But also we're trying to do something on regional level. And the first thing is trying to build the capacities of the institutions in terms of their human resources. We can never match the salaries in the private sector, unfortunately, to our IT experts to keep them in the institutions. So there has to be a quick mechanism for training and retraining people so that we can actually have capacity within the institutions. And this is where, again, the cooperation with the private sector comes on the table as well. But additional thing that we all need to do is invest in infrastructure. And especially in Western Balkans, we're trying to invest regionally in digital infrastructure, digital connectivity between the countries, but inside the countries ourselves. Because in order for us to be, also to bridge the digital gaps, we need to provide the people the access. So currently, we in North Macedonia, with the support of World Bank, we are investing heavily into National Transport Optic Network that will provide broadband coverage to the white zones in the country. We should be finished in 4 or 5 years by now, but this should allow all citizens access to fast internet. But again, unless we're connected, unless we're all doing this together, and unless we're also trying to build our resilience together, then we're not going to be successful, because the attacks, the dangers can come from all over the world, and no country by itself can actually be efficient into trying to resolve these issues. And I would fully also agree that the education is extremely important, especially from the very earliest stage, so that the children could also be thought of critical thinking, but also to be thought of how to, and these are very simple things, not even technical things, to protect themselves from all the well, unfortunately, dangers there are in the cyberspace. So these three things: international cooperation and with the business sector, investing in infrastructure and in education, we should be able to also increase the international cooperation, but also to bridge the digital gaps all over.
Thank you. So, Mr. Dopierała, we are all talking about this international cooperation. How significant, in your view, is this digital cooperation for developing countries?
Well, I will refer to what Mr. Painter said before and just reinforce this. Developing countries, no matter how we try to define them precisely, but we all have some general sense what the term means. They have a disadvantage because they're not advanced countries, but at the same time they have certain advantage because they can build certain things from scratch. And well, we've seen this in other industries. Poland's been an example, for instance, in our financial services sector, that which under communist times was, totally in the dark. And now we are quite advanced because we were able to leapfrog and learn on the mistakes and on the experiences of others. Same with cybersecurity. So those countries who are just starting their entrance or entering more into the digital space, they can really learn a lot from what has been done around the world. And if I look at our field, I mean European Union, Cybersecurity Act, or NIST directive, these are the things that can be readily almost copy-pasted in such countries. When I'm saying this, I have African countries in mind, and okay, maybe not copy-pasted, but they can serve as a very good inspiration. So they don't need to reinvent the wheel and really start to think about it all from scratch. They can look like what are other countries, and so start thinking about the legislative actions, start thinking about the education, start thinking about creating certain institutions that will govern and that will protect their cyberspace. And sure, there must be a difference depending on the advancement of the country. And again, if it's a country that has very little electronic economy, I mean digital economy, then probably they have other priorities than installing cybersecurity solutions. But they can definitely, each country has certain, even the least advanced countries, they have some presence in the digital world, and definitely they should be protecting those based on the experiences and the solutions that have been developed by others. Clearly, joining the forces like the CESIRs or those national teams who collaborate about responding to the incidents or preventing the incidents. So not inventing all this from the beginning, but leveraging on the work done by others. If I take, for instance, the approach to this by a smaller country, they should define the industries which should be protected because they may be attacked. So we're talking about some risk analysis, and doing the risk analysis in a programmatic or a structured way, and then defining, okay, we have many priorities in a given country, but these cybersecurity threats are real. If they happen, they will really hurt us, so we need to take care of them. But then it's important to look at those threats from the holistic perspective. So it's not just, okay, we will install antivirus and anti-malware and we're done. Yes, you have to look you have to look at the entire process, like the whole supply chain, let's call it, from the beginning to the end. And it's not just protecting certain elements, but it's protecting the whole chain and everything in between. And these lessons can be easily learned from the other countries. And actually, I mentioned we work in Africa. That's the knowledge we bring, and that's why they want to work with us, because we bring them the know-how.
Thank you very much. Mr. Painter, during your time at the US State Department as the first global cyber diplomat, you were instrumental in launching first of the kind whole of government cyber dialogues and capacity building programs with dozens of countries in Europe, Asia, the Americas, the Middle East and Africa. What lessons do you draw from this experience, and what guidance could you give to future initiators of similar projects?
So one big lesson, I think, is that no country and no group within a country, whether it's private sector or even different departments within a country, have all the answers to this. That sharing of information and collaboration at both, it doesn't matter if you're a developing country or a developed country. I know Norway just did their fourth, I think, cyber strategy, and so they've learned each time, for instance. One of the things that we did, two things. When my office was created, it elevated the issue to more of a policy issue. So it's not, cybersecurity is an important technical issue, but as long as ministers or leaders of governments think of it as just a technical issue, that's not going to make it really get the traction it needs. It needs to be thought of as a key issue of national security, key issue of economic policy, and ultimately a key issue of foreign policy and really national policy. And so that transition is happening, but I'd submit it's taking a while to happen. And so one of the things we did is we launched these all-of-government dialogues, as you mentioned, which meant that it wasn't just the State Department meeting with their diplomatic counterparts, as interesting as those conversations might be. We brought along the entire range of the U.S. government. It might shock you to know the U.S. government is not all that organized, and sometimes departments disagree with each other. So bringing them together, and that's true, I think, in every government. I don't know of many governments that are that had that unity of view on everything. So, we had our Commerce Department, which did the economic policy. We had our Treasury Department. We had our Defense Department. We had, of course, the Department of State. We had our Homeland Security Department. We had our Department of Justice. And that forced the other country, and the first one of these that we did was Japan, to bring the whole range of government players from their side. And that results in a much richer conversation, because sometimes those government agencies don't even know what the other government agency is doing. And so that's helpful. And then we supplemented it by having a second day or a second half day with other stakeholders, the private sector, civil society, and others from both countries. And again, that really produced a much richer environment and to follow up. And it also helped us collaborate on capacity building efforts. I mentioned one of the ones we did, the first one we did was in the East African community, so a regional one. We did it in ECOWAS, which is in the West. We did it in the South, the SADC part of Africa. We did it with the African Union. We did it in Asia. We did it a lot with the Organization for American States. So those capacity building efforts, which were started pretty small, I think were really valuable to try to get that information shared. And now the EU and others are doing lots of capacity building, and that's great. And that kind of collaboration is important. But part of it was building institutions within governments. So governments organize differently. Ministries of communication are critically important, but you also need the foreign ministry. You need the interior ministry. You need all these players to play because the threats we're seeing are just not tactical threats. They are threats that go to, for instance, our election security. They go to our infrastructure. They really need to involve. You have to have this unified approach in government. It doesn't matter who has a lead, at least as long as you have coordination. I think that's one of the things that we learned from that.
Yeah, so we are all playing the same game. Mr. Bem, I have a question. Taking your broad experience and knowledge about developing countries, how can we help ourselves by helping others?
So, you know, a lot can be said, especially in the financial sector, which is very competitive. Think about different peer banks that are present globally. We all compete against each other, but we compete in the sense that we bring different services potentially at a different price point. We bring different offerings to our clients. But the moment we face cyber as a crime, as a problem that is global, we stand united. And I think that is the key message that's important to understand. The reason why we make the effort and the reason why we support sustainable global goals is that we truly believe that by helping, for instance, developing capabilities in countries where potentially we sometimes observe certain threats originating from, we need to ensure we have strong partners we can rely upon and call at the moment we have a problem that they can help us ultimately deal with. So again, it's the same message all over. It's cyber is a franchise risk. It spans across all geographical jurisdictions. It doesn't really take into account borders, and that's why by especially investing in countries which still require certain help and expertise, we help ourselves by developing their capabilities, but also we help ourselves, and especially also as professionals in the field, we grow personally working with those people, exchanging information, building the trust and developing the relationships that will help us go a long way.
Thank you. Minister Niedużak, what is the role of Poland, of the state, in building cybersecurity capacities in other countries? Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, when you asked that question, I just remember that there is this, I think it's a report or some sort of a study commissioned by the European Commission on cybersecurity and synergies between the civilian sector and the defense sector. And one of the conclusions is that basically all the ideas, all the innovations, they all happen in the civilian industry, and then they go into defense. So why did it come to my mind? Well, because I'm not sure if there is. No, let's put it like this. The most important thing that we could do probably right now is to help our commercial sector grow and develop. That's why I've mentioned the report, because this is where the innovations will take place. They are taking place, and they will take place, hopefully. And that's the best way, because this is the way we could transfer the knowledge from the sector to maybe also other countries. But at the moment, to be very honest, the Polish agenda on that is not probably as ambitious as it should be.
Thank you very much. Mr. Manchevski, a question about China, which is Africa's main economic partner. What about cyber space and cyber cooperation? Where we are, and maybe you can tell us also about the Western Balkan region as regards Chinese presence.
I got a hot question. I just want to add where my colleague, the minister, ended, and he might not be aware, but this morning I had a meeting with the Minister of Digital Affairs of Poland, and we just agreed that we Poland is going to share the legal framework surrounding NIS and critical infrastructure so that we can use the experience. So this is how you're helping, even without being aware.
That's a clear example of how different departments don't know
Don't
don't know what they're doing.
On that issue, the most difficult thing coming now from the side of the government, in the government, is horizontal coordination between institutions. It's easier to coordinate with the private sector, and horizontal coordination among the institutions is the most difficult task. This is what we waste most of the time, but this is the most crucial one, as Mr. Painter said. Coming back on
The Chinese question.
China question. We as a country are in a very specific situation. We were waiting to become a full NATO member, and we were on the doorstep since 2008. So we're almost there, and because of the name issue with Greece that we've just resolved, we were not allowed in. So basically, we did meet all the criteria, especially technical criteria, until 2008. But since then, there were a lot of offers that came. And some of those offers came from China, in part, in a way of donation of equipment. And this equipment has been installed in the last decade in North Macedonia, and some even critical communication systems that are now critical for NATO. So what we're doing now is extremely fast change of equipment that does not meet the NATO standards. And with the latest worries about, well, I would put it this way, of security of data with some of these vendors that provide some of this equipment, and this equipment has already been installed in our country, we had to react fast and had to replace this equipment. Now the problem, the public sector will not be the problem. The problem still remains in the private sector, because these companies are huge. They're vendors, they're suppliers of equipment to some of the biggest European companies and telecom operators that are operating in our countries. And we as public institutions use the services of these operators. These are some of the biggest. I mean, Deutsche Telekom, A1 from Austria. I'm coming from the operators operating in North Macedonia, but there are others around Europe. And this is actually something to be considered on European level for the private sector as well. What is to be done? Because again, we as institutions at the end of the day end up using the services of the operators. I mean, we do have secure communications, but not among all institutions. The critical ones, yes, but we can never connect all institutions with governmental network, whatever, which is secured, and we use the regular operators. So we've dealt with the issue in the level of the public sector, but the problem still remains with the private sector. And again, I don't see us being able to resolve this alone as a country, but it needs to be addressed on international, at least on European level.
Probably what I will ask should be addressed at this level too. So, Mr. Painter, I would like to ask you about this cyber hygiene, because it's according to the EU Cybersecurity Agency, ENISA, it is actually still a remaining biggest threat to cybersecurity in Europe. How can we deal with that, with the lack of this cyber hygiene? We are talking a lot about education, but it's maybe a little bit more than that. And how can we coordinate the effort internationally, maybe?
So let me just start by adding one other thing to the China question.
Why not?
So I think this is a real challenge, because China has been building the infrastructure for a lot of African countries. And Western countries either don't have the resources or haven't devoted the resources to match that. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be engaging with those other countries, because China's view, and one of the reasons China's doing this, is they're trying to win those hearts and minds to adopt their system, which is one that is really restrictive, is trying to restrict content, not just not just the kind of malicious activity that we see. And a lot of those African countries are worried about stability, and they like the idea when the Chinese say this will give you stability. But having that kind of freedom, that intercourse, that ability to operate in an open market is also something that's very valuable to them, and I think we need to be engaged far more than we are now. Now, on the
Cyber hygiene.
on the issue of cyber hygiene, absolutely. I mean, there's studies. I don't know. There's lots of studies out there that say like 85% of the attacks and intrusions that happen are because cyber hygiene is bad. In fact, the big threat actors, the North Koreans, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, don't need to use their sophisticated tools most of the time because they can use very unsophisticated tools because systems aren't patched. And criminals, of course, can do this too. Now, I think we can't simply solve that by public education. I sit on the board of a company called the a nonprofit called the Center for Internet Security. It has 20 controls. There's other ones that other parts of the world have. That if you just follow those 20 controls, you've done a pretty good job of securing your networks. And there are things like patching your systems and others. We need to get that news out there, but we also need to elevate it so the end user is not responsible. The ISPs and others have to take a bigger role, in my view, to do this, because you're never going to get your grandmother to patch your system. This is not going to happen. It has to be more automatic. It has to be moved up. And then we have to make this a priority to get people and businesses to adopt this. One thing people, it's always a dirty word in the US, but do you have to come up with some kind of regulatory framework? Will there be I'm a recovering lawyer, but there's something called a standard of care, which we don't have in cyberspace, and that drives liability, and that drives insurance. And even though we have insurance, I'd say it really doesn't match the threats we're having. So we need a much more mature system. Now, it could be all these voluntary things like the European Cybersecurity Act, like the NIST framework in the US, will create a standard of care, and we'll do this over time, but I think the urgency is here now.
Okay, so we have 1 minute and 40 seconds left, and two speakers that are lacking their final questions. So I would like to ask Mr. Bem and then Mr. Dopierawa, as they represent the private sector, what are their recommendations for the public actors to implement so that they can listen closely. So, Mr. Bem.
So it's interesting because, I suppose working in the financial sector, all our lives, we listen into the public sector recommendations for the private sector that we need to implement, and this is an opportunity for me to weigh in. And otherwise, I think be realistic about your expectations, especially in the sense of notification. So to those of you who don't know, most of the regulator entities have an obligation to notify of any incident in a timely manner. Now, obviously, timely manner suggests it's as soon as possible, but some jurisdictions require that notification be made within 15 minutes. If you think about managing a crisis or a material incident that impacts your entity, I think it's easy to understand that the first minutes count the most, and you can't really afford figuring out whether you have to call these guys or those guys. You need to think about what really happened, whether it's a true positive, and whether there's an immediate action you need to take in order to contain the damage as much as you can. Be realistic in your expectations, and have faith in the sense that we really care as a sector, and the topic is extremely important to us, but I think that doesn't go beyond that.
Thank you. Mr. Dopierawa.
Well, 14 seconds, I won't make it in 14, but seriously, I believe that in any country, there are certain industries that are quite well organized and taking care themselves for cybersecurity, and there are branches or sectors which do not. If I look at Poland, if I, for instance, think of hospitals, if I think of local governments, of municipalities, they know that cyber threats exist. However, speaking with them, they have so many other priorities, and they have not been affected, luckily, and thanks God, so far. They are thinking, okay, that's for the future. So I believe this is the role of the government, to create certain very practical solutions for those who should be cyber protected, but don't have the means, neither financial nor manpower to do it. For instance, a SOC for hospitals, yes, or a SOC for local governments. Very simple, down-to-earth things, not advanced. Today they have very little, so just to take them one step further, one step higher, and this could be something that the government could do. Almost made.
Thank you very much. So following up on this, plus also cooperation, coordination, and education first. Thank you very much for this discussion.